Does God care about small places? How can we faithfully serve Christ in a rural context? What is the future of the church in rural America? The Rural Ministry Podcast deals with questions like this and much more in the hopes of bringing practical resources and inspiring stories to help the church flourish in rural communities. Dr. Charlie Cotterman is the Executive Director at the Center for Rural Ministry, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Grove City College, and the pastor of a rural church in Oil City, Pennsylvania. Join the conversation as we journey into the good things God is doing in small places. All right. Well, welcome to another episode of the Rural Ministry Podcast, where we talk about the unique challenges and joys of living and doing ministry in rural places. I'm your host, Garrett Heath, Director of Media and Communications at the Center for Rural Ministry at Grove City College, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Dr. Charlie Cotterman. Charlie is the Executive Director at the Center for Rural Ministry, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Grove City College, and the pastor of Oil City Vineyard Church in Oil City, Pennsylvania. So in our last episode, we began a brand new series based on the theme from our annual conference we held just last month entitled The Local Church on Mission. Today, we're on to our second episode in that series, and buckle up. We're going to get a little more academic today, for me at least. Not for you, Charlie. This is easy stuff for you. But we'll be talking about some really important themes, actually, as we move forward. We'll be discussing the two redemptive structures of God's mission. It may sound a bit heady out of the gate here, but fear not. I promise this is actually super practical in how it plays out, and hopefully we'll just lay a good foundation for the episodes that follow. So Charlie, lead us forward.
Man, that introduction that sets a pretty high standard. I don't know if I can live up to it, but I am excited about this because I first came across some of these ideas back in seminary when I was studying under one of my mentors, Scott Sundquist, who was a missiologist and a church historian. And my wife and I took a Perspectives on the World Christian Movement course. And honestly, this stuff has really influenced how I think about ministry, how I think about mission. And so I think it is super practical. And sometimes we do need to think like deeply to get to the practical, actually. You know, sometimes we just want to start with practical, but I'd rather give it a good thought. I think last time we talked about the kind of ready, shoot, aim mentality, and we're trying to actually aim before we start.
Well, it's important sometimes to think through, like, why do we do things the way we do? Why don't we do things a different way, right? Like, it's important to discuss the why, I think.
Absolutely. So just a quick review. That's what I always do. I usually do this in class and at church because I do not assume that someone remembers where we were last time when they jump in.
I barely remember.
Yeah, right. There you go. So we talked about Barnabas, right? And we talked about him being this encourager in Acts. And we talked about his attention and his intention, his intentionality and his attentive posture, where, first we see him being maybe perhaps literally a door opener for Paul when he takes him to meet the leaders of the Jerusalem church that didn't want to meet him because they had heard about his history. And Barnabas makes the way there. And then we see Barnabas having some real intentionality when he shows up in Antioch, and there's so many good things happening with the gospel. And to his credit, he's not like, I know what they need me. No, he says, I know who they need Paul. And so he goes and finds Paul, and they come back and minister for a year. And he's not worried about who gets the credit or any of that. Just such an encouraging thing. In church history. But here's the thing. If it just stopped there, I think we would have less of a story than what we have in Acts because it keeps moving on. The mission needs structure. Most of us probably know what it's like to have an idea and we're like, man, this would be a great idea, but we have no idea how to bring that idea to fruition. And I think that could have happened in the church had not a few things happened that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, sounds good.
So what I want to do is help us think this through with one of the probably greatest missiologists of the 20th century, a guy named Ralph Winter, who lived from 1924 to 2009. He helped start Frontier Missions and did a lot with the study of missions in the 20th century. Just a genius, actually. If you look at his bio, he's just an amazing thinker, but he had a great heart for mission. And he talked about missionary structures, and we're going to get into those in just a minute. But before we get into any of the actual structures, I feel like I need to like defend structure for a minute. Maybe this comes
Yeah.
because
Well, sometimes they get a bad rap, right?
yeah, I think so. Maybe it's my background where like there's this kind of, some of y'all listening are coming from this like, I love structure. Structure is like what, the book of order. Like I just love structure. And like the background I'm from is not necessarily known for structure. Right. And so sometimes I have to defend structure, I think, because people just think structure means bureaucracy, which isn't the case actually.
Right. All the red tape but
Right.
without
But
some
structure is
structure, like, things can just devolve into chaos, right? And not really get off the ground in a way they need to.
absolutely. We think of all the worst ways structure can go. We think of, red tape, government bureaucracy, all the stuff. But we don't think about things like structure in our everyday lives. I was just listening to a podcast with the poet Malcolm Guite, and he was talking about how structure in poetry. So he writes like poems with like traditional poetic structures because he's like the structure actually brings out the poetry. It's like we all like rivers, we don't like rivers without river banks. And
Yes, bad things happen.
right, the structure is what makes it helpful. Or think about, you and I both like sports. Think about sports, like if you have a game without rules, it's not going to work. If the poetry of someone like a Michael Jordan or someone like that, a great athlete comes from being able to work within the structures in a fascinating and creative way.
That's right. I mean, in structures, we think of structures being limiting, right? We think of them as being limiting, which they can be, but sometimes that limitation is just what we need to fuel something brand new, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, maybe one of the most classic early examples of this is even just, marriage itself. Like that's a structure that God gives us before the fall.
Yeah.
And talk about a creative thing. It is literally a procreative, creative thing. So
Yeah.
that's structure. All right. So let's jump right in. And we're going to go back to Acts because we need to hear what happens next in this Paul Barnabas story because it's super fascinating. And so I'm going to read from Acts 13, just a few verses today. And this is how it goes in the beginning of Acts 13. Now there were in the church in Antioch prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, a lifelong friend of Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul, or Paul. While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them." Then after fasting and praying, they laid hands on them and sent them off. Now, at first you might think, well, like, okay, great. Like we're so used to hearing about this that we don't think much about it.
Mhm.
But something big happened here. And we need to take a minute and think about it,
Yeah. Unpack it a little bit for us.
Sure. So if you think about what's happening here, they had been ministering, they had been preaching in Antioch. But in this is one of those, again, kind of one of those hinge moments. We talked about hinge moments in scripture last week or the week before, with Abraham going. This is one of those hinge moments where something new happens that really shifts things, right? And what scholars talk about here is the beginning of what we might call a missionary band, right? So this is something where the church itself, centered in Jerusalem, is doing what the church does. But here's something new, a new structure for reaching the world. And this is what Ralph Winter talks about as one of the two redemptive structures. So, Garrett, I think you have that quote from a talk Ralph Winter gave in 1973 that helps lay out what these two things are.
Yeah, for sure. I'll go ahead and read it here. Thus, on the one hand, the structure we call the New Testament Church is a prototype of all subsequent Christian fellowships, where old and young, male and female, are gathered together as normal biological families in aggregate. On the other hand, Paul's missionary band can be considered a prototype of all subsequent missionary endeavors organized out of committed, experienced workers who affiliate themselves as a second decision beyond membership in the final structure, or in the first structure.
Yeah, and that is a fascinating distinction that Winters picks up on there because he talks about these. Now he makes his own terminology, and these terms, I don't know. I still am kind of on the fence if they're actually helpful or not. He calls one modality that's That's kind of a structured fellowship, but it has no distinction of sex or age. Just basically the church. The church is a
It's
modality.
the church, yes.
And a sodality is these kind of missionary bands that are limited by something, whether it's interest, or you think about monasteries, limited, only men can be monks, only females can be nuns. They're limited by something. And that even that idea of a second decision that, all people who belong to Christ should be a part of the church, the modality. But not all of us are called to be a part of Africa Inland Mission or, uh, Gospel for Asia or whatever it is, whatever organization. So there are these second decisions to say, yes, I'm part of the church, but I feel God's leading me to do this special thing. And that's where the sodality kicks in.
Yeah, and just to be clear, like it doesn't necessarily matter what we call these modality, sodality. It's just
Right.
important that we remember these two structures, right? So
That's right.
modality is church.
Yes.
Sodality is essentially these missionary
Right. Or think of
structures,
it, maybe
right?
the easiest way is the church and a voluntary association doing
Yep.
something where people come together for a purpose. Christians come together for a specific purpose. Um,
Yeah, so why is this distinction important? Like
Yeah, well, I think what it does is it allows the church to do new things. It allows the church to kind of get outside, as we heard from Steve McVeigh, get outside the building, to leave the building in certain ways and do things that are really hard, do things that not everyone can do. Literally, not everyone can just drop everything and go around the Mediterranean world like Paul and Barnabas did. They have, families, they have responsibilities. There's certain things God's called them to they can't drop. Even the James and Peter, they're taking care of the church in Jerusalem. They can't just go and leave that duty behind, right? So these things do different things. We'll talk a little more about that later, but I want to point out an example from history that Winter talks about to kind of illustrate this. So he's talking about Gregory the Great, who was then Pope, and a guy named Augustine of Canterbury. And this is the mission back to England. And he says, as strong as Gregory was, he was merely the head of his own diocese, though be it a big one. He
mhm.
simply had no structure to call upon to reach out to the intended mission other than the sodality, which at this point in history took the form of a Benedictine monastery. That's why he ended up asking Augustine of Canterbury and a group of other members of the same monastery to undertake a rather dangerous journey, an important mission on his behalf, rather like a mayor contracting with a private business to do a job for the city. The purpose of the mission, curiously, was not to extend the Benedictine form of monasticism. No, Augustine of Canterbury went to England to establish Dionysian Christianity, i.e., the church. He's establishing churches. This is quite characteristic. During a lengthy period of time, perhaps 1,000 years, Winter says, the rebuilding and building of the modality or the church was mainly the work of the sodality or voluntary association. That is to say, monasteries were uniformly the source and real focal point of new energy and vitality which flowed into the church or Dionysian side of the Christian movement. We think of the momentous Cluny reforms, the Cistercians, the Friars, finally the Jesuits, all of them strictly sodalities, but sodalities which contributed massively to the building and rebuilding of the Corpus Christianum, the network of dioceses which Protestants often identify as the Christian movement. And that's what I want to point out today is that we see in history these two kind of ways of living out the gospel or redemptive structures. This is two ways that God has shown in Acts and then through Christian history that he reaches the world through his church and through his people that are united around a calling, a mission that they've received from him and from the church to go out into the world.
Yeah, so essentially there's like a unity of like partnership here, right, in these tasks. And without one structure, you can't have the other. But without both structures working together, you don't have the fruit. Is that?
Yeah. And it is mutually beneficial. It is symbiotic. You really, it seems like we need both. God wants both, and so that's what we see playing out here. And I want to just give a couple examples in history. One from kind of the birth of English speaking mission, and a name most people will know, William Carey. And then another from kind of the birth of American mission, which is probably an example that fewer people know. And then we'll get into some super practical things we can think about in our own community. So bear with us with a little bit more history. I'm a history guy. Actually, Garrett, you are too, right?
I
So
am too.
we're going to do a little history first, and then we'll talk about what it means for our communities. So I want to talk about William Carey for a minute. So you may know, listeners, you may know William Carey as kind of the founder of modern missions. Now, that is true in the English-speaking world. I'm not going to lie. Some Germans were doing it before him and others, okay? But for those of us who call English our home language, this is our kind of native son. And so he writes in 1792, a tract with a very long title. I'm only going to read part of it. An inquiry into the obligation of Christians to use means for the conversion of the heathens. Right? There's a lot in that title, and it keeps going, actually, but we're just going to leave it at that.
It's a great title. I love those old titles, by the way.
Yeah, I know. It's like a whole book in itself. You know, they didn't have the same kind of short attention span.
It's like the Cliff Notes right in the title.
Right. That's right. I think like with our short attention spans, I think we just lost listeners when I read that title.
I think so.
But the key word, the operative word there is the use of means. And Carey laid out his rationale because people did not accept this. They weren't just like, wow, great idea. You know, we've been reading the Great Commission for a long time, Carey, and we think you're right. No, that's not how it went over. So you have another quote, Garrett, from Carey himself that I think would be helpful for us to hear.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So suppose a company of serious Christians, ministers, and private persons were to form themselves into a society and make a number of rules respecting the regulation of the plan and the persons who are to be employed as missionaries, the means of defraying the expenses, etc. This society must consist of persons whose hearts are in the work, men of serious religion, and possessing a spirit of perseverance.
All right. So a few things to point out about this. A, you see that yes, there's a role for leaders in the church, ministers, but there's also a role for laity. That's an important part of this kind of voluntary association sodality side, that it's not just clergy. And then they're making specific kind of plans and structures for carrying this out. It's not just like, we want people to know about Jesus, so we're going to pray about it. Yes, pray about it. But they're like, and we're going to use means, practical tools to help bring this knowledge to them. And the thing he was pushing them was to get beyond what the actual church itself could do. And I think this is something that's helpful because we so often think of the best churches as kind of the Walmart supercenter churches, right? So we think of the best churches as the ones that have every program, they have every kind of staff, they have a counseling center, they have it all. I mean, I'm glad some of those churches exist. I'm also glad that that's not the only way the church can be the church in God's redemptive plan.
It's a good thing, in fact.
Right. For most of the people listening to this podcast, you're like, thank you, Lord, that is not the only way to be the church, because that's not what my church looks like, or almost any church around that I know of. You know, but sometimes we feel the pressure that the church has to be all things to all people. And here we see Carey saying, actually, we need something outside the church if we're going to do this. The church itself isn't prepared. And we see Winter saying in history, even like Pope Gregory the Great knew the same thing was true. And that's why he asked Augustine of Canterbury to go on the mission to England to kind of re-evangelize it, because the church itself wasn't made for that. And so what Carey does is he launches kind of the first English-speaking missionary society out of the UK, out of England. And it starts to inspire people. And some of the people it inspires are actually across the pond over here. And they start thinking about these voluntary societies. And so I love this story. And this is a real rural story in some sense too. So we just need to be telling it. I think when we tell stories, we inspire the next generation. So we need to tell good stories. That's a whole nother podcast and a whole nother soapbox that I'll get on at some point. But we need to tell stories. So this one is about a haystack prayer meeting. Yes, you heard that right.
This sounds very rural.
It does, doesn't it? A haystack prayer meeting. Some of you are like, I had one of those last week, you know. This is something that just, I mean, like, think about how we talk about people. Now, we don't hear this much anymore, but it used to be like someone that from a rural place was like a hayseed. Like they because they like had hay in their hair. Like it was like a kind of way to put people down from small places. And here we have a haystack prayer meeting that actually changes the landscape of American mission forever. Love it. So let me tell you about what happened. So in 1806, and by the way, it happens from a bunch of college students. So like represent younger generation. This is amazing. In 1806, a group of students at Williams College, it's in Massachusetts, a small college, still exists today. They were committed to regular prayer, and they were praying for their students, their campus. And one of the things they prayed for was international mission. And one day, as these students were praying, a thunderstorm came, and they couldn't, as the story goes, they couldn't pray on campus because of the opposition they faced. So we think of like, man, America just always loved Jesus so much. No, like they couldn't pray on campus because of the opposition. So they're praying outside. And one day a thunderstorm comes, So our church has done VBS in a park because we don't have a building. Let me tell you, when a thunderstorm comes and you have this planned thing, it is not fun. I have experienced that. So, but they're like, what do we do? They go under a hay mound that was like half eaten by a cow. So it was like overhanging like a mushroom. They go under it and they keep praying. They're not deterred. And that day, the special focus of prayer was for the awakening of interest in foreign missionary work among students. Well, God answers this prayer in a powerful way. And he answers it in part through a young man who was helped to lead that, named Samuel Mills. So Samuel Mills keeps praying, keeps working. And from that day, they have kind of new energy. And so 4 years later, he goes to his denomination's national conference or conference, whatever you want to call it, in New England in Massachusetts. And he makes an appeal for a voluntary association from America to reach the world for mission. And from that appeal, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, I know it's a long name, they like long names back then. The American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions was founded, and it was the first non-denominational, interdenominational missionary organization in the United States. And it sent missionaries out into the rest of the world. His prayers under that haystack were answered. It's an amazing story.
You're right. That is not a catchy acronym there. ABCFM. I like the ABC. They were on the right track.
Man, we got like alphabet and radio going on. I don't know. But alphabet soup, a lot of this alphabet soup stuff happening in history. But
nonetheless, some powerful results, right?
Yeah, it made a huge difference. And so and these people, by the way, were hearing stories of Carey, hearing stories of even in this country early on, David Brainerd and his work among the native people. And these stories were inspiring them. All right, so let's get out of the history. Let's come back and make a couple points that are super applicable, I hope, for you wherever you're at.
Yeah, well, it brings up some questions and some practical stuff here. I mean, just this history and how the modality and the sodality interact in a healthy way, right?
That's right. Well, and maybe that's a good jumping off point because, the nature of kind of the human condition, we'll put it that way, is that we are always trying to make a case for what we're involved in. We like self-promotion and or self-preservation, right, are real things. We so often live with this scarcity mindset that like there's not enough, which is crazy if you think about God and the story of Scripture. There's always enough with him. But one of the things that happened, and this happened for Carey, is that the church starts saying things like, well, like, aren't we good enough? Like, like, are you saying we're doing something wrong? Like, if you've ever tried to do anything new at a church, especially if you're a lay person and you felt this, you know what I'm talking about. Like the church is like, well, what's wrong with what we already do? Like we already do something like that. Isn't it good enough?
The point is nothing is necessarily wrong.
Right. That's right. But maybe God is saying there's something new. There's some way to do this in a way that God's just putting on your heart, like Paul's Macedonian call. It wasn't, that there was anything wrong with like Asia Minor. It was just like God was saying there's something new going on and you need to go do it.
Well, and on the flip side of the coin, it's important, I think, to remember too that like it's just as easy to get off track when you're part of the sodality.
Oh yeah,
right. Like maybe even more likely. Well, I mean, we absolutely can't throw out the modality. You have to be part of that modality in order for the sodality to really be fruitful.
100%. And that is where we're going to come back to that at the very end today and land there, I think. At least that's the
Mm-hmm.
goal. We'll see. The plane's not guaranteed to land, but we're going to try. But like we see that, I'm on a college campus most days of the week. And if there's anything true about campus ministries, it does a ton of great work. And it's what's also true is sometimes students use it to take the place of a church. And you can have the first, tons of great work, uh, and the second happening at the same time. And we can say the first is great, and the second's like, well, let's like think about that a little more, So no side is like, this is the great side. This is the you're okay. Well, we'll keep you because God says, but like, no, both sides are needed. Both sides have to be humble, and they need to be integrated, right? Because the church, sodalities need the church. Let's think about this. So we just have been talking about how churches need the sodality. The church sodalities need the church too. So the church, one, anchors God's people in the history of scriptural interpretation and the sacraments in a way that is still essential. Like,
Well, the church is where the life is,
yeah,
right? That's
that's
how
right.
we attach to the vine, right?
That's right. And it's how we attach to what God's done in history. A lot of churches even talk about this idea of apostolic succession, that like we're connected back to
Yep.
the church historic. The church does that in a way that voluntary associations don't. And this is very important too. The church creates a space where all are welcome. And we need to remember that. There is something good, about saying this group of people in this voluntary association, are doing hard things. Like they're like, maybe this group's like the Navy SEALs, on some level, but like not everyone can be a Navy SEAL, right? Or maybe this group's like, the people that are really good at this or that, and not everyone can do that. We need a place where everyone, regardless of your ability, where you were born, what you look like, what race you are, where everybody, male or female, come together under the goodness of Jesus. And that is the church.
Yep.
And that's why if the church loses that, if the church becomes the church of one party or the church of one socioeconomic class, we've really missed it, because a church always has to be a place where all people can be under the goodness of God.
Indeed.
And that's why sodalities can't have the only word. They are always in conversation. So, Pastor, if you're hearing this, the church is absolutely essential, and Christian worker, lay person who's running some ministry that you feel called to, that's super good and essential too. And the most essential thing is that you guys stay together in conversation. But if we're going to think about local mission, here's where we're going to get super practical for just a couple minutes at the end. If we're thinking about local mission, we have to remember both of these kinds of organizations do different things, right? So church leaders, absolutely, you need to do all you can. I mean, I always say, like, I hope our church looks like our town. And I don't think we're there yet, but if you come to the Oil City Vineyard, you should feel like I'm in Oil City. You should feel like I'm in this place. Like, we look like our town. We are big enough to welcome everybody in. But we also can't do it all. Like, none of us probably listening to this are running like a Walmart Supercenter church where everything's there. We need people doing stuff. And that's where, like, in our community, we have these folks doing amazing things. So there's a woman that attends our church who helps lead like a used clothing store, but that's free, called Hope 21. And they're doing amazing stuff. And it's not part of any one church. It's for the whole community. It's a voluntary association of people who are called to that. And I am so glad it's out in our community doing that work. Another woman's doing a ministry called Freedom Northwest PA, where they're taking on human trafficking and some of these things in our community, in our larger region. Our church, we just don't have the capacity to do that, but they're out there doing it. And here's the thing. The beauty of that is, if that was if those things were under the church, they probably wouldn't get enough time and energy. There'd be one ministry among many. They might not get a big budget line. They might not get a lot of pastoral thought, because we're just trying to like care for people. But when it becomes like this organization with some people that really care about it, suddenly the attention to that goes so high, and the calling, and so it's beautiful that the church doesn't own, quote unquote, those things, but that they're out there.
Well, and I think another beautiful thing about that is how, even by having these structures in place, modality, sodality, that the limitations of the structure there even create an atmosphere where people can better utilize their own gifts, right?
You don't have to go through a formal educational structure. You don't have to have an MDiv. You don't have to have a PhD. You have to have a call from God and an interest in a certain thing, and you can move into it. We need more of these. And pastors, honestly, one of the things I think we can do is be on the lookout. We can be like Barnabas. Who is God highlighting? Who is God putting a real interest in? And maybe they think, well, I can't do it. The church has to do it. No, maybe, pastor, your job is to say, go do it, because God has called you to it. And we just release you to it, and we'll support you. We'll do what we can to fund it, but we don't need to administer it, right? Because here's a fascinating thing, and this is what history teaches us. In the 19th century, so these mission organizations that got started, the 19th century is a century of American mission. It's amazing. And you know who was running it? Little groups of women in church basements running women's missionary societies. And it was taking over the world. And then guess what happens in the 20th century? We have denominations say, you know what? We can do this better. We're professionals. Trust us. And it becomes bureaucracy.
Yep.
And missions dies. We don't have time for that in rural communities, because our communities need God's love now in all kinds of ways. And the church does it in the way God's called the church to do. But we need to see people who God is highlighting with special interests, who we just say, we'll do all we can to encourage, all we can to support, but we're not going to administer it. You go do what God's called you to.
Oh, it's good stuff. And I think this is going to be a good springboard into some future episodes here as well, right? We have some guests even lined up for some future episodes to come and talk about kind of these very things, right?
Absolutely.
So yeah, just a little spoiler for some things to come. But that's a wrap for this week's episode. We hope our conversation has provided you with some encouragement, insight, maybe even a practical idea for your own ministry context. The Rural Ministry Podcast is part of the good work being done at the Center for Rural Ministry at Grove City College. If you found this podcast helpful, there are a few free things you can do to help us out. First, you can share this episode with a friend or colleague you might think that who could benefit from it. Second, you can leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. This helps more people discover our show. And lastly, leave us a comment or suggestion on the episode page over at the Center for Rural Ministry YouTube channel. We hope to get some good conversations started over there as well. Thanks for listening, and you can learn more about our mission by visiting www.ruralministry.org. Have a great week.